Right, ladies and we'll be starting the presentation. I will just start by giving a few instructions to the people online about what they can do. So, hello everyone, welcome for joining this webinar with Guillaume Dumas, Dr. Guillaume Dumas, about harmonizing minds, hyperscanning, interbrain synchronization, and clinical implications. So, for everyone who's online, you can use the chat features to introduce yourselves, where you're coming from, what you do, are you a music therapist? Then if you have any questions for Guillaume about his presentation, you can put them in the Q&A function. And everyone in person will be also keep notes of your questions. You can also write them in the Q&A if you're joining the Zoom. Then only the people who are presenting, the panelists, can share their audio and video. So if you want to ask a question, speak, we won't be giving you that authorization. Just write them down in the Q&A if there's anything you'd like to say and ask. And very last, I will put the newsletter link for you to be up to date for upcoming SIMTA lectures and SIMTA research with the newsletter. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Clemens Mayrhoff, a senior research fellow at the Cambridge Institute for Music Therapy Research, to present our Guillaume. Thank you.
Yes, hello, and thank you all for coming, and also welcome from me. I can see there are more people from Canada joining us. Hi, Carolyn. Hi, John. I'm Clemens Mayrhoff, senior research fellow here at SIMTA, and it is my pleasure to introduce Guillaume Dumas tonight, who is an associate professor of computational psychiatry at the Université de Montréal, and directs the Precision Psychiatry and Social Physiology Laboratory at CHU Saint-Justine-Azrieli Research Center and the Myla, Quebec AI Institute. I'm not sure how much I pronounced correctly from that, but I tried. Guillaume is recognized as a global scholar by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and a future leader in Canadian brain research by the Brain Canada Foundation. Guillaume bridges scientific research and societal impact through his advisory work on national AI strategies and his contributions as an invited expert at the United Nations. So it's my pleasure to welcome Guillaume tonight, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Hans. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here virtually, but still with the heart, to share past, current, and future work, and especially given the topics and the interest in also some of your work on music therapy that resonates, pun intended, with our work. So today I will present a lot of work from different collaboration across the pond, starting in Paris, moving to Boca Raton in Florida, then back in Paris, and now in Montreal. And I always start with these slides with the word Ubuntu from South Africa that kind of embody my topic of research, but also my philosophy of research, like the idea that I am because you are, and that scientific endeavor is a collective mind jazz. And I love this term, to have this collaborative mind jazz with friends and colleagues. And so I have especially the chance now to have a big group in Montreal covering different topics from social neuroscience and clinical psychology to machine learning and more like AI. And well, the focus of today is more on the social neuroscience. I will speak briefly about the AI at the end, but I will mostly focus on the social physiology and the idea that more than 10 years ago, when we started this adventure, well, as put by my colleague Leo Schilbach and Bert Timmermans and colleagues, well, two individuals engaged in dynamical interaction was still like a bit of a blank spot of social neuroscience. In their BBS, they were comparing that to this metaphorically dark matter of neuroscience. And now those days, after more than 10 years, fortunately, it's not anymore. And we have even expanded beyond 2 individuals to n individuals in interaction. And it's very, very motivating to see this field blooming and getting more and more mature. And in my personal path, I try to, on top, combine this interactive social neuroscience with the more like earlier loves. I come from physics and engineering originally. And so computational biology was an ideal partner in this scientific endeavor. And I had the chance to have been advised to move to these fields to have a meaningful interaction with society through clinical practice and medicine. And so in our lab, we are trying to combine those 2 approaches, like social physiology and integrative neuroscience, with more like systems biology and computational method to achieve a precision psychiatry, and even in a neologism, in an interpersonalized psychiatry, first with the personalized rather than precision, to mention that actually there's a person there. Like precision medicine come more from oncology, where it's a more somatic approach. But when we are dealing with psychiatry and mental health, the subjective experience and the personhood and the embedding of this person is fundamental. And interpersonalized, because of course we're interested in the interpersonal relationship of those people and how their social embedding actually has a fundamental role in the way symptoms emerge, but also potentially are treated. And in this context, I'm particularly interested in developing a dimensional transdiagnostic approach to mental health, aligned sort of with the NIMH research domain criteria, but adding on top of the existing dimension that the RDoc are focusing on to the symptoms and the social behaviors. Because like in a weird sense, from a sociological point of view of science and funding agencies, the NIMH stop at the individual. And so like everything that is more like social go to another agency. And I feel like it's a good example of how actually our sociology of science and our social embedding as scientists can actually interfere with the focus of our research, actually. Anyway, so even recently, I've been also moving to AI, being associated with the MILA, the Quebec AI Institute, where here we are trying to bring those knowledge from social neuroscience and embodied cognition to modern machine learning and artificial intelligence, kind of saying for some people something obvious, which is that cognition takes place in time. So to bring temporal dynamics inside the discussion of modern machine learning, that we have a biological plausibility that could lead to nice inductive biases and mechanisms that can be operationalized and useful for those modern machine learning approach. Typically, deep learning was a success story out of it, like inspired by the neo-connectionism and the way the brain is hierarchically structured. But in the lab, we are especially interested in social embodiment. So as a disclaimer, I did my PhD in the former lab of Francisco Varela. So I grew up scientifically with this strong influence of embodied cognition and inaction. And here the idea is that AI in this current situation focus on a more disembodied approach with these chatbots that have no bodies, so to say. And so we are trying to steer those approaches to either virtual worlds in 2D or 3D, extended reality avatars in virtual reality or mixed reality, and even robots. So as I say, like I grew up scientifically reading Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, and as like a deep influence on my way of approaching science. And one of the key questions that has been obsessed for almost 20 years is the question of others in cognitive science. So how we deal with other people. And in his one of his last work, Varela was facing the history of cognitive science in relationship with this problem of others, with the early 60s and with the Mexican conferences and the birth of cognitive science as a traditional problem. Like we see on the left, an illustration from Lev von Forster on constructing reality with the man with the bowler hat, showing how infinite recursion of dealing with others in a classical and naive computationalism lead to a problem. And progressively, the field matured into connectionism and neo-connectionism. And through the development in the late 90s to 2000, others have become like more in an ecological psychology form of affordance, or like others as a interactive partner. And so that's more like the inactive embodied cognition. And interestingly, at the end of his life, he was fascinated by the question of first person versus third person inquiry with this kind of co-constraining dynamics of first person towards third person and third person toward first person with the project of neurophenology. And recently we have been working with Anne Monnier and Lena Adel on what he called the generative neurophenology, or where like the actual social embedding of individuals play a constitutive role in the development of the self and the experience of the subject. And so this is like kind of the very big picture theoretical framework that we are working on. But in a more classical neuroscience pragmatic approach, we are tackling a very pragmatic and very down-to-earth problem, which is that actually when we're interacting with other people, we have two brains and even two bodies that are sharing information to the environment. And in the same way that the early work of Francisco Varela in intra-brain synchronization showed that there is no specific locus of control in the human brain. It's more like a distributed neural assemblies that coordinates between each other and make emerge functions from this coordination. Well, in the context of social interaction, we have those dynamics that are coupled to perception and action loops. And this coupling generates a new type of system that is not like in the classical communication view with the emitter and receptor, like two things that are separated, but actually from this point of view, a one integrated system that is the dyad. And so to tackle this dark matter of neuroscience with two individuals engaged in dynamical interaction, for like almost 20 years, I've been developing a research program on naturalization of social interaction with, on one side, the more empirical inquiry using hyperscanning, especially hyperscanning EEG. Now we are doing other types of hyperscanning, but starting with EEG. And it's explainable by the historicity of the lab with Varela and neurodynamics, because EEG provide a very fine-grained recording of the brain dynamics. On the other side, coming from physics and engineering, of course, I've been like very happy to put those skills at play to create models of those empirical findings. And so we started the first modeling of two brains in interaction in silico. And then after my postdoc with Scott Kelso in Florida, to work at the intersection of those two fields, empirical and modeling, through the combination of empirical and interaction of a human with a model of a human. And we call that at the time human dynamic clamp, inspired by the dynamic clamp in electrophysiology. But it takes multiple flavor now in our lab, and we are very interested in convergence of, for instance, virtual reality, extended reality, and how to combine virtual agents with natural agents. So let's focus on hyperscanning EEG, which is more like the interest of the today. So first, like where the scanning come from, because hyperscanning was in fact associated with fMRI originally, so the scanning, but the name was so cool that people kept it for other modalities in a way. So the word was coined by Reed Montague at the time in Georgia Tech, where they, in this very seminal paper 2002, explained the basic concept. And already in this paper, they were envisioning cross-brain neurofeedback and very interesting ideas from the start. And this thing then was extended to other modalities. So in my case, I was more interested in the hyperscanning EEG for the reason of the temporal sampling rate. So in this review, they are comparing, to me, not very fairly, FNIRS and EEG. They have a bit bias on the FNIRS part. Typically on the EEG, the spatial resolution is not that bad actually. And in a sense, to me, with source reconstruction now, EEG MEG can be both good in temporal and spatial level. And typically, like the range of possible tasks and robustness to motion of FNIRS being enormous and very good is also to be cautionary with, because I'm working now with FNIRS and actually it's not that robust to motion. And EEG can be, with the rays of signal processing, actually extended to more inline motion correction, or at least motion rejection. But anyway, so we have all those different modality at play. And fMRI was among the first to deliver. Then EEG, FNIRS get a lot of traction those days. Guess it's also because it's very easy to operationalize and deploy. But I would put a caution also on the robustness to motion, etc. Anyway, so in our case, we started with a dual system inspired by developmental psychology. So my former PhD advisor, Jacqueline Nadel, used this double video in the 80s, 90s to study mother-babies interaction. One of the study I like the most is this one, where they use this dual video system to have a baby interacting either live with their mother or with the pre-recorded video of their mother. And we're able to show through measure of attention of the baby that at 3 months old, babies are already sensitive to very fine-grained contingent dynamics with their mother. That's demonstrating that at very early age, we have already the biological mechanisms to deal with those fine-grained coordination at the social dynamic level. And so we extended with Robert Soussignan and Jacques Martinery, who was my second PhD advisor, a former colleague of Francisco Varela, who worked on more on the chaos theory and neurodynamics. So we combined this dual video system from the developmental psychology lab with dual EEG system to make a connection between the synchronization at the behavioral level and the synchronization at the neural level. And before even talking about interbrain synchronization or synchronization, we took also this occasion to test how classical neural correlates of social perception were modulated by the role that we are taking or the context we are having those interactions. And that was already a very important message to the community of social neuroscience, because we've shown that first, I mean, it seems obvious, but social interaction is different from social perception. That was like the vast majority of social neuroscience recordings. But on top, even social interactive tasks were modulating in a subtle way brain dynamics depending on the role that you're taking or the context in which the interaction unfolds. And one of the differences typically that we observe is that in the spontaneous context, there is more symmetry of brain activity despite the asymmetry of the roles than during an induced or forced interaction. And second, the spontaneous context was eliciting a sort of social reward in both people, while in fact in the induced context, it was only the model, the emitter, in so to say, that has an intrinsic reward. So unfortunately for you, that means that I have more reward than you giving this talk. And it has consequences in the way of approaching education. So after that paper, actually, I started collaborating with people in science of education, because it pushed for peer learning methods and more like project-based learning with interaction between peers, rather than a mono-directional way of carrying teaching. So of course, like the biggest discovery when we did that was this interbrain synchronization, where like we were observing for the first time without any rhythmic external stimuli, because it has been done by, for instance, the team of Andreas Linderberger in Berlin, that guitar players following the same metronome had their brain entrained and got synchronization. And actually, it was for me a major paper to get me going, because it was not easy to assume that we're going to be able to observe that during social interaction. But here, without any external metronome, so like the two people are spontaneously interacting and co-anticipating each other's behavior. So they entrain each other to each other, so to say. And it leads to fine-grained synchronization up to even the gamma band, which was a big problem at that time. Like to get this paper published, it took me a lot, like 11 desk rejection, because even people were not trusting or believing that the data were sounds, given that we observed interbrain synchrony up to the gamma band. And it took me like 12 years to demonstrate what was going on with those gamma band. I will talk about that at the end. Because indeed, it's very surprising that while our behavior is much slower, our two nervous system can be entrained up to the 40 hertz. I mean, like that sounds even surprising indeed, but the data were there. So, but after this difficult start, we managed to publish other contexts. So the first was nonverbal. Then we moved with my colleague Alejandro Perez to language, and show that, for instance, speaking your native language compared to a foreign language help to get synchronized with your interlocutor, and maybe account for the easiness of alignment of representation of symbols and concepts. And later on, with my colleague Pavel Goldstein, now in University of Haifa, and Simone Chametsuri teams, we show that affective touch, so without even rhythmicity, just like holding the hands of a loved one, was eliciting not only a release of pain, but also was modulating those interbrain synchronization. And so this paper was interesting for two reasons. First, it was the first time that we demonstrated properly that indeed affective touch could have an analgesic effect. And so in the question of care, this is a very important results, because like we are talking a lot, including me, on using AI for mental health and so on. But actually this paper showed that having a human being holding your hands has a physiological impact on your pain. And the second interesting result was associated with those interbrain synchronization, because of course, after people were even questioning that it was possible, it became for them completely obvious and uninteresting to have those interbrain synchronization, saying that it was trivial, it was just purely entrainment. But here we show them the contrary by taking social interaction that was arrhythmic. So in that case, there's just holding hands. There's no stroking. It's just like holding. But still, we have those interbrain synchronization, and they are modulated by the behavior. Another modality that is arrhythmic, but super interesting also, because it was during the pandemic. So another sensory aspect that was a bit neglected during this pandemic, which was the odor, like smell. And so we study mother and baby's interaction with the mother wearing a t-shirt for 2 consecutive nights. So the IRB was fine with that. So we had like the smell of the mother in a jar, and we had babies interacting either with their real mother or with another mother of another baby in the experiment, but wearing a new t-shirt or the t-shirt with their real mother smell. And we showed that just the body odor, so the t-shirt with the body odor of their real mom, was enough to replicate the same level of engagement and interbrain synchronization between the baby and the mother. So that's showing again like how this phenomenon of interbrain synchrony may be affected by different modality channel, and even at very early age. So now we are working a lot with babies as well to understand more the developmental aspect of those synchronization. And finally, always ironical to do that on Zoom, but we had this study showing that actually doing Zoom meetings and video conferencing actually interfere with those brain-to-brain synchronization. And in that case, we did that with the mother, with adolescents. And one of the idea behind that was that the integration of self and other dynamics within the brain are in the order of 20 to 80 milliseconds, which is corresponding actually to the jitter of modern buffers in the digital world. So now I understand better why my elders prefer landline telephone, because there is almost no delay at the audio level. But in Zoom meetings, we are completely fighting on this jitter all the time, unconsciously. And this may be one of the reasons we experience this Zoom fatigue, because interacting with someone else on Zoom is making this additional effort without necessarily having consciously this effort to us. Like we can feel it very well when the delay become too big or the Wi-Fi collapse, and then we see that. But if you want to make the experience, I owe that to my friend Susan Dicker. Try to sing Happy Birthday on Zoom with 10 people. You'll see it's a disaster, because everybody has a different delay, and so like actually those delays are really there. We don't notice them most often, but they are there. Also with Ruth Feldman teams, we study how bonding and human attachment shape those interbrain synchronies. So that's the work of Amir Jalowski, where Amir did a tremendous work recording 3 groups, romantic partners, best friends, and stranger with 2 different tasks. So either a motor coordination task or more like an empathy giving task. And this study showed that it's not trivially correlated to the level of human attachments. So in the context of sensory motor task, it is. The more you know the person, the better you are at coordinating with them, and the more synchronized your brain are. But for the empathy giving task, we ended up having a weird result. So like one of my favorite quotes is the Isaac Asimov quote saying like the best word to hear in science is not eureka, but that's weird. And here we were like with the results where the actual romantic couples were less neurally coupled during this empathy giving task. So like best friends were better than strangers, but the romantic couple not. And so now we are discussing that in the context of couple therapy by making the hypothesis that in case of people living for a long time in a romantic couple, they may have internal model of the other partner. And instead of relying on nonverbal immediate cues to relate to their narrative, they are more introspecting in the model that they build up of the other person. And so in that context, like having spoken with a couple therapists, it may be actually the challenge to release those prior about the other partner and being more listening to the ongoing behavior and social interaction, rather than more like relying on this internal model of the other. So until now, we spoke mostly on the dyadic scale. I guess like the challenge now is also to move beyond that. So my colleague and friend Susan Dicker already did that in 2017 in classrooms. So recording up to 12 kids during a classroom. And that's a big next step for the field, I guess, like to have a deployment in more ecological context, like classroom or hospitals, and embrace also the group instead of just the dyad. So here, for instance, at the hospital, my PhD student, Lena Hadel, is working on, for instance, family therapy. So how to deal with the complex clinical alliance forming in group setting. Those are like a big challenge for the field in the future. And another emerging thing is like people using animal models, non-human animal models, are also stepping inside the hyperscanning wagon. And so my colleague Weiji Hong at UCLA, for instance, did among the first recording at the cellular level of interbrain synchronization, and showing that in pairs of mice, those interbrain measurements that we observe in EEG at the scalp level actually can be probed at the cellular level using microscopy and calcium imaging. Of course, given your center and your interests, one of the big challenges also like deploying those hyperscanning recordings in clinical context, and what does it mean from a clinical standpoint. So we have been working with Susan Dicker and others on deploying those hyperscanning recording, typically with autistic individuals during structured interview with clinician or with their parents. And recently with my former postdoc, Quentin Moreau, we published the first study in the lab of EEG hyperscanning in dyads with autistic neurotypical or neurotypical versus neurotypical, and show that during the spontaneous imitation, there is indeed a difference in the level of interbrain synchronization when we compare control group and mixed dyads. But one of the conclusion of and that was also a motivation for this study, is that instead of looking at one single brain and kind of explaining the problems or the differences in social behavior as like, oh yeah, the autistic brain has the problem. Here we want to take the approach of saying like it takes two for tangos, and like having this interaction is a symmetric problem. And so there's a growing number of interests and studies in what's called the double empathy problem. So like the fact that neurotypical has much problem to guess emotions or to step in the shoe of neurodivergent people, than the neurodivergent have problem to step in the shoe of neurotypical. And our approach to neurodiversity and autism in the lab is trying to understand from an interpersonal point of view what's going on for those neurodivergent people when they have to interact with neurotypical individuals. And so, well, that's what's the first study, but we have a large cohort ongoing with children and their parents, and where we record not only the EEG, but also subjective experience, physiological recordings, language, etc. And the goal is to have an open data set for the community to study autism in this more interpersonal fashion. Another topic of interest in the context of hyperscanning and clinical context is therapeutic alliance. So for that, we have the chance to have collaborators, for instance, in Harvard, Vitaly Napadov, for instance, working on the therapeutic alliance in pain research. And in our case, we are looking at typically, like I said, family therapy. So there is a growing number of studies on that. We just released last week. So again, Lena Adel, in collaboration with the team of Michael Lifshitz at the Jewish General Hospital in McGill here in Montreal, where we did a systematic review of the people trying to study clinical alliance using hyperscanning. There is like a lot of theories out there, not so much data. So that's like a field that require to bring some data out there. And the main challenges are like the small sample size. I mean, working on that, I can totally understand and relate to this, because like having deploying hyperscanning in clinical setting for psychotherapy is not easy at all. So the small sample size is a big issue. There's also a trend of oversimplification of alliance. So typically there is also like a sort of mock clinical alliance context with like more coaching than actual psychotherapy, and the concept of clinical alliance can potentially integrate those contexts, but it's different to have an alliance in the context of coaching and in the context of psychotherapy. And there's a gigantic variability in brain patterns. Coming from more like physics, I guess it's also imputable to the small sample sizes, so you have more noisy data at that level, but also like willing to push for more like standardization of the pipeline and systems of analysis in hyperscanning. I think it's also associated with the fact that being a nascent field, we are not exactly using the same method, the same pre-processing, etc. And so we need to have a better standardization to replicate those studies. So that's, I mean, the proposed solution are kind of mirror of the limitation, so to say, like we need to increase sample size, make a better complex analysis of alliance and not oversimplify it. And of course, trying to develop standardized pipeline and guidelines for the domain, for the community. And so you can snap the QR code if you want, like the paper is freshly out from last week. So, and if you're also interested on the question of interpersonalized psychiatry, there's like these two papers, one short that I did for word psychiatry, focusing on other extension of interpersonalized and interbrain metrics, such as like neurofeedback or even interbrain stimulation to force artificially synchronization between brains. So we have like some people in the lab that are starting to do that. It's still like very emerging. We're doing that on adults on single brain, and now we're going to move to multiple brains. And the other piece with my colleague Dimitris Bolis and Leo Schilbar is more in the context of autism and how we can build a collective psychophysiology and this idea of interpersonalization of psychiatry. So as you see, like there's a growing interest in this technology. When we started in 2010, we were among the first doing that. Now 2025, more than 100 studies a year. So that's very motivating to see the field growing like that. And I always make the joke of this paper in the mid-60s because actually interbrain synchronization started in science in 1965 with those two people publishing a paper with just like one sentence abstract and one figure as data. So at that time, it was much easier to publish in science. And they were like, unfortunately, claiming to have demonstrated extrasensory induction, so namely telepathy. So sadly for us, I guess that's why during 40 years, nobody touched ever multi-brain recordings because of that. So we have to be careful on what we are doing with those recordings. I've been like a lot contacted by people who wants to study telepathy and so on. I'm not at all. I'm trying to fight for like saying like it's not magic. I mean, you can say in a sense that social interaction is already magic, but there's no such thing as telepathy in what I showed you before. It's really based on exchange of information through perception and action. But yeah, I mean, we need to mature those data also in the context of theory. So for instance, I've been working with philosophers like my colleague Mel Verhulst on how recording multi-brain synchronization or connectivity is actually recording different things, so simultaneously. So we are measuring, in a sense, the similarity between two systems, whether it's like at the behavioral level, so doing the same task, being part of the same neurotype, so like the work on autism tap into that for the similarity. But something I'm super interested in also to develop, and I joined the group of Lorenz Kiermaier, for instance, at McGill in transcultural psychiatry because of that, is the cultural modulation also of those dynamics. So all those similarity are actually on top interacting. So there's like a growing literature of cultural neuroscience, for instance, with Shinobu Kitayama or Andreas Roppenhorf also, showing that if you record social interaction in Asia or in North America, of course, you will get different patterning at the behavioral level and even at the brain level. And on the other side, we are also recording, well, communication, exchange of information between those two systems, whether it's unidirectional or reciprocal. And the point is that those two things are co-constraining each other. So I was referring early on Varela and neurophenology, where the first and third person are co-constitutive. Well, here we are like having a same kind of non-reductionist take on that by saying like, well, the similarity between the two systems affect our ability to communicate. And it's through communication that we are also increasing our similarity at the cultural level. So those two things are recorded simultaneously, and the design of our experiment needs to account for these different factors. So on a more down-to-earth way, on top of conceptual developments, we also need to standardize hardware development. So with Paulo Bajasa and Alejandro Perez again, we worked on developing guidelines and technical reports to help people setting up their own hyperscanning systems. And an ongoing work that will never end probably is the development of iPipe, so the first open source hyperscanning toolbox that wanted to summarize all the interbrain connectivity measure out there and facilitate for the community to standardize their pipeline. So we started with EEG, but now it supports as well FNIRS, MEG, and OPM MEG. So, and maybe one day we're gonna even integrate fMRI, so we're gonna have all the modalities. And we are also working a lot on integrating language, movement, and physiology as a cofactor of the analysis to be helpful for the community at deploying those techniques. Another topic that is very important is the question of causality. So until now, I mostly worked on correlation, and we had exchange with Giacomo Novembre and Ianetti on the problem of causality in hyperscanning. So one of the take is that we need stimulation and hyperstimulation to be able to probe the causal link between brains. And actually, Giacomo Novembre was one of the pioneers in that, like starting to do hyperstimulation in humans and showing that, for instance, in the context of tapping and training in phase, the two motor cortex was facilitating coordination at the motor level. But recently also in mice using mobile optogenetics, it has been shown that entraining two mice synchronously in the PFC was leading to more social approach and social behavior compared to the two mice synchronized, not synchronized, but stimulated, but not in a synchronous fashion. And so they did that even with three mice. Well, like two were synchronized and the third was desynchronized, and show statistically that the two that were synchronized had more approaching social behavior. So we are like starting to move from, well, we moved from this impossible to this is trivial to this may have actually potentially a causal impact actually. So that's very exciting to see those animal models assessing causality. With Quentin Moreau, we also propose other alternatives to test causality. So one is inspired actually by the first paper by Reid Montague to use neurofeedback. So by using cross-channel feedback, we can have a direct causal impact on interbrain synchrony to behavior. And that has been already started by some people, for instance, doing brain-computer interface with two people controlling the same video game, for instance. Another approach is to use structural causation. So for that, we took from the philosopher Karl Kraver, who wrote an amazing book I deeply recommend to everyone interested in explanation, called Explaining the Brain. And in that book, he explained that causation can take different flavor, including a structural causal form. And for that, typically, we used the human dynamic realm developed by my regretted colleague, Emmanuel Tonioli, and my esteemed friend, Scott Kelso, with a human interacting with a computational model of a human. And in that context, we were able, and that's also in collaboration with Quentin Moreau, to demonstrate that the RTPJ, the right temporal parietal junction that appear as a hub of interbrain synchronization, is actually a hub within the brain between the self and the other representation of behavior. And so that's more like a structural causation in a sense, that's saying like, the RTPJ is causally associated with this interbrain synchronization, because actually that's the part of the brain where self and other information are combined. And so in the context of social interaction, the self of one person become the other of the other person. So that's the most symmetrical part of the brain in a sense, in information sense. And the third type of causation is the logical causation using counterfactuals. And we call that the no-brain recording. This is a no-brainer, which is like in silico hyperscanning. So how to use computational model to demonstrate the causal implication of stuff. And so we did that, for instance, at the end of my PhD at the time, it was the rise of connectomics. So we used among the first connectomes to test the anatomical structure impact on interbrain synchronization. So combining what you have on the left, the diffusion tensor imaging and the fMRI atlas, I built like two virtual brains engaged in a spontaneous interaction. So the motor area of one brain are coupled with the visual area of the other brain and vice versa. So typically, if I move my hands like that and you try to imitate my movement, my motor cortex is correlated with the movement of my hands, and the movement of my hands is correlated with the dynamics of your visual cortex. So virtually, my motor cortex is coordinated with your visual cortex, and vice versa if you are doing a spontaneous imitation. And so by doing so, we show that the real connectome, so we were able to shuffle the connections, stuff that cannot be done empirically. So here it was computationally. So the real connectome in blue was not only eliciting more interbrain synchronization, but also actually on the x-axis, this is the coupling between the brain. So the more you exchange information and the greater the synchrony between the two brains. And this is not the case if we scramble the connectivity. So it was already known that the real connectivity facilitates information exchange within the brain, but we show that actually may also facilitate synchronization between brains compared to a random topology. Another big message for people doing hyperscanning in this paper is that you have always residual synchronization. So you can see that even when the x-axis is 0, which is like absence of information exchange, you still have a spurious level of synchronization, a bit higher actually even with the real connectome. So the more similar your system are, the higher the spurious synchronization at baseline. And so in a sense, what you need to do during your experiment design is to measure the right part of the blue curve here and the left part of the blue curve. That's this part on the right, like that is interesting to measure in hyperscanning. Doing a paper just showing that there is interbrain synchrony is in fact meaningless, because the only way to not have synchrony would be to have two random number generators. And fortunately for us, we are not random number generators. So we have always a kind of baseline synchronization, even if we are not interacting, but just being part of the same species and embedded in a similar, statistically speaking, world. So that actually was also connecting and resonating with my interest in autism by saying like, well, maybe actually that could be one way autistic individuals have an issue with coordinating with others without having to pinpoint a specific brain area or a specific gene. And I've been working on autism for more than 10 years now. I can relate to the fact that it's a minefield, like the world literature of autism is a minefield. There's you can find something and its opposite. And I kind of abandoned the idea of finding a golden phenotype or a golden signature that would explain all form of autism. And here we take like a step back and saying like, well, maybe heterogeneity that is extremely present in autism could be like the distinctive feature about it. Like, and by being neurodivergent and more like heterogeneous, they are less inclined to harmonize and coordinate with neurotypical. And so that's now one of the leading topic in the lab. So how we can study neurodiversity and its impact on the ability to synchronize with others. And computational modeling on that respect are very powerful. So another example of those computational models is related to this gamma band synchronization that was my damnation at the beginning. Like we got like more than 10 death rejection because of that gamma synchronization, but it was there in the data. We proved it in different ways statistically. And it took like indeed 12 years to show that those inter-brain synchrony in the gamma band are pretty legit actually, but are not what we thought they were. Like it's not like that we are exchanging information in the gamma band through behavior, but there's in parallel to hyperscanning, there have been a growing literature in neuroscience on cross-frequency coupling with low frequency nesting, higher frequency within the brain. And so we did a simulation where like you have interbrain coupling just in the theta band, which is not controversial at all because there is like this motor equivalence, for instance, from the work of Scott Kelso in the 90s, showing that the velocity of movement is actually coherent with the phase of theta in the motor cortex. So you have this interbrain coupling in the theta, and then within the brain, you have the theta phase that is nesting the gamma amplitude. And then we measure interbrain synchrony in both theta and gamma. And what we found is that indeed, when you have a growing coupling between brains in the theta band, so that's the x-axis, and you have increased cross-frequency coupling, that's the x-axis here, you can see that the color that measures the interbrain gamma is following the interbrain coupling in the theta perfectly. And so when you compare a coupling with no coupling, you're going to find a very robust interbrain synchronization in the gamma band that is actually an indirect effect of the theta coupling and the cross-frequency coupling in the two brain individually. So what you measure here is very robust, but it's not the exchange of information in the gamma bands, it's the information that is synchronized by through the theta band at the lower level. So just to wrap up, I'm going to illustrate a bit what we are doing also in AI. So I mentioned already the social neuro AI thing. So we are, for instance, interested in simulating those alignments between brains, but between artificial brains. So we are simulating little agents in framework called multi-agent reinforcement learning, and trying to probe which cognitive architecture make them more cooperative. So we are experimenting, for instance, with cognitive architecture associated with neuroscience of consciousness, such as the global neural workspace or the attention schema theory. and showing how those inductive bias at the architectural level help those agents not only to perform better at the individual level, but also at the collective level. So that's one line of research. But in the other side, we can use AI also for social neuroscience. And so typically, it's very complicated to do deep learning with hyperscanning recording because the data are scarce. So one of the first study that we did was to train a single brain deep learning architecture, here represented by this H theta. So here you can leverage the large cohorts of single brain recordings that are publicly available. And then once you have trained this encoder for single brain, to have a smaller neural network that integrate the encoding of the participants to these encoders and make classification, for instance, on autistic or not. And we show that a naive deep learning approach would lead to almost a random guess, while our approach with transfer learning leads to up to 89% accuracy. So that's like something that is already in preprint, but the architecture is on GitHub, and we're also willing to share this knowledge to help people in the field. Another approach with colleagues from actually from Cambridge, and Eduardo is now moving to Oxford, if I remember. So in Cambridge, Richard Bethlehem in the psychology department, where we try to operationalize information theory also. So most of the thing that I mentioned until now was associated with dynamical systems theory and more like linked to also my lineage with Varela and all the embodied dynamical system people and Scott also. But actually there's also a big community growing in information theory, and those are like also very powerful methods. So we have this preprint on how to measure redundancy and synergy between two brains in interaction. I think that could be a wonderful complementary approach to the field. So combining on one side dynamical systems and on the other side information theory. So take-home message, yeah. So we have interbrain synchronization. We show that social interaction is different from social perception, that there is like interbrain synchronization that can be observed in verbal interaction, in arrhythmic interaction, in groups, in mice. But the challenge is to go to causal explanation, potentially with hypersimulation, with hyperneural feedback and human-machine interaction, and also computational modeling. In the context of clinical alliance and clinical settings, and I took that from our recent published review with Lena, we need to increase the sample size and have repeated measurement, potentially longitudinal cohorts to assess the stability of what we are measuring. We need to adopt a multimodal perspective on phenomena like alliance. I mean, not only clinical alliance, actually, even social interaction in general is multimodal. And finally, we need to have more incentives for replication and standardization, from pre-registration of analysis plan to actually data sharing and open source code for greater reliability on inter-brain synchronization. So with that, I leave you with Levi Kotsky and Arthur Rimbaud on, again, like very nice quotes associated with what I just mentioned, like through other we become ourselves, and I is another, je est un autre, from Rimbaud. And I will take your question with pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I can hear the people clapping in the lecture hall downstairs, so I'm trying to convey that also here. Thank you very much. Yeah, and we have some questions, and maybe we start actually with live questions in the lecture hall, if there are any. And maybe people have to come to the...
We're going to have Jorg ask a question. It would be nice if you can, or if you want to come around, they'll be there.
Guillaume, thank you very much for this very comprehensive and giving your state of the research where you're the work that you've shown to us. But now that you came back to the therapy side, so which is exactly where we are working on, and especially when you're looking at this complex analysis of the lines, this is exactly what we are, as, let's say, therapists, music therapists, making use of the music. And of course, we're looking at the time series of the interaction between two players in the therapy.
Yeah.
And given your AI work that you were showing us as well, I was wondering, do you see, I mean, we don't have enough data, that's what you say already there, and we need more cases and so on. But I mean, as much as I'm sure that we can't really come to an answer right now, but ideally there would be like a biomarker for social interaction, how much that in a therapy situation could be, achieved by measuring, with a few, as we have that in the neurofeedback, with a few electrodes, that we would have the chance, like, the steady state, for instance, for social interaction. And I wonder what your prediction would be to go into what else is needed on that. So that's it.
Thank you for your question. It's not an easy one because, like, I guess, like, the easiest low-hanging fruit was to pursue in line with Wolfgang Thatcher work and Ramsayer on synchronization in psychotherapy at the movement level. And we're like kind of very inspired initially to get in there by this work. But what we realized, and I like fascinating discussion with psychotherapists since we started, including good old psychotherapists that have immense amount of experience. And that made me question a lot, like the generalization of only synchrony is good, in the sense that sometimes rapture are also moments of epiphany in a therapy. So there is that. The second thing is linked to the study that I show you with the romantic couple versus best friends versus stranger. Well, like we saw that the attachment and the task are non-linearly interacting. And so I think that we are at the level where now we're getting familiar with how to measure those phenomena, but it's only a start in a sense. Like we need to better understand what does it mean to be synchronized in different frequency bands, and what does it mean in this context, how it's modulated by the level of attachment, etc., etc. And I think information theory in complement to dynamical systems can be super important in that aspect. I think also AI can help a lot to pinpoint meaningful events. So like one of the challenge, I think, in hyperscanning in general, actually, but specifically in the kind of clinical context, is that we cannot do repeated stimuli and average. Like no therapy is unique. Like no session is reproducible in a sense. Every session is different world. So that force us to develop mathematical tools to be able to do that in a real-time setting in a sense, which gonna be complicated, but also can be extremely useful once it's developed for even empowering clinician in real time. So what I'm dream of is actually during the session to have even a feedback for the clinician. So we're not yet there, but having a feedback is definitely something of interest. What I'm working on right now with a psychotherapist here in Quebec called Christian Bertoli is to work on praxology and having a sort of reflective work after the session. So using AI to feed the video and the interaction of the people, and using AI identify moments where they were like too much synchronization or too low synchronization compared to the rest of the session, and then come back at the video, what happened there, and having like a discussion about it. And it's more like qualitative, it's more about pedagogy and growing as a clinician, but I found already that could be an interesting tools to, after a session, to have this kind of vignette of relevant moments where you can go back to it and say like, yeah, something happened there. And sometimes you are aware of them, and sometimes you don't even notice them. So that's the thing we are getting interested in right now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Very interesting, and also very close to one of our projects where we have a post-session interview, video-based interview, where a therapist and client watch the video of the session together. And yeah, anyway, but any is
I see an end.
Yes. I have a question about, as we consider moments of interest in the therapeutic process. And, you know, as a therapist, I might identify a moment or moments of interest, but a client might identify different moments of interest in the session.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, you know, if you've explored those differences in what you see in that process of these different moments of interest from the therapist's perspective or the client's perspective.
Yeah, that's like, actually, that's a problem that we also experience in these other projects with mother-child interaction. So we are trying to, in the spirit of Francisco Varela, willing to connect the subjective and the objective. We do an interview of the people, but it's not necessarily the same moments that pop up from one perspective and from the other. Sometimes it does, and maybe that's actually where like it's very strong, like when it's a mutual acknowledgement that there is meaningful thing happening, but it doesn't have to be like indeed symmetrical for sure. Yeah. And in family therapy, it's even more complicated because then you can have so combinatory approach. Like sometimes the parents are seeing something very relevant while the kid is totally ignoring what's going on. And sometimes the kid that noticed something. So that make it even more challenging to capture. But what we hope is that maybe like nonverbal analysis, like physiological recordings, or even not even like the semantic, but maybe at the language level, the rhythmicity of the language, etc., could be an indicator of moments of alignment or rupture. I have like actually one of the psychotherapists, we are working also on AI agents for simulating patients. So like I'm not really for deploying AI as a psychotherapist. There's like still a lot of ethical problem with that. But one opportunity that we see is like it's very hard to train people in psychotherapy. So we are starting to develop virtual patients to train psychotherapists, and working with these experienced psychotherapists. They were like, well, but the problem with your chatbot is that they are speaking all the time. Can you train them to just shut up? because in fact in psychotherapy, silence is also super meaningful. And it was for me it was a funny epiphany having this old psychotherapist telling me that. And I was like, well, we need to tell those bots how to shut up, indeed, like to simulate the patient, but also potentially if we want to have them actually playing also a counselor or more like a psychotherapist side. I mean, sometimes silence is more meaningful than speech.
Right. I'm realizing we're already 10 minutes over time, but I think it's a very good and fruitful discussion. Are there any more questions in the audience downstairs? Otherwise, we have three ranging from short to maybe longer questions in the Q&A. Maybe you want to address the first one there already, because I think that's straightforward.
Yes.
Answer.
So I can read it. So it's from Rebecca Atkinson. And the first question is, I overheard your interest in how free energy principle can be a good way to mathematically model social interaction and hyperscanning, but you mentioned a concern about how researchers should not confuse the map with the territory. I guess this called from more data, but how would you recommend to avoid this pitfall in researching social neuroscience with the FEP, example studies including music? So thank you. Well, I have a very adversarial friendship with people in the free energy principle community. So I tend to simultaneously engage with them scientifically and openly disagreeing with them on many topics. And in the lab, we are also trying to work with those formalism. I think it's more formalism for me than theory, to be honest. Like, I think it's a very interesting way of formalizing mathematically cognitive processes, but I won't go through the line of saying that it's a theory of how the brain operates. And that's where, like, maybe my mention to Korzybski map territory fallacy come from. I think there are many formalism out there, and committing too much to one maybe blind you to phenomena that are not well modeled by this formalism. So that's one of my concern. If you are interested in that topic, I strongly advise a paper called, actually, "The Math is Not the Territory." They play on the pun on that. So the math is not the territory. That is a bit of a good critical thinking on this free energy principle community.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, given the time, I think we nevertheless, at some point we have to stop, I'm afraid. So I'd like to take
I mean, people can reach out if they have, I'm easy to find on the internet. So I really like to mind jazz, as I say. So feel free to ask questions later if you need to. All my work is open source and open access also on the website. So you may not have problem to find them.
Yeah, website is a great resource. Yes, can recommend that. So yeah, thank you very much again, Guillaume, and sure people, and at least me, I will come back to you with questions. And yeah, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I think Leo has some last remarks for the next, oh, well, it was actually the last lecture of this year, but I hand back to Leo anyway. But thank you very much, Guillaume.
My pleasure. Bye. Thanks again for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much for joining us online, for those who are still online with us. I'm going to put again the newsletter link for you to subscribe to it and be aware for our next year's SIMTER lecture series and for other SIMTER news. Thank you very much.
Thank you.